I'm Erica Loading, and on behalf of the Keough Center for Civil and Human Rights and our colleagues at the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies in the Keough School of Global Affairs, I'd like to welcome you to this second event in our series, Behind the Games, exploring civil and human rights in the Olympics. We are thrilled to welcome Keough Faculty Fellow, Dr. Diane Desierto, as our principal speaker today. Dr. Desierto is a professor of law and global affairs and the LLM faculty director at Notre Dame's Law School. She also holds a joint full professor appointment with the Keough School of Global Affairs. She received her JSD and LLM from Yale Law School, where she had the honor of serving as a law clerk at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, Netherlands. She received her JD from the University of the Philippines. At the conclusion of Dr. Desierto's talk, we'll be joined by Dr. Josh Eisenman, an associate professor of politics in the Keough School of Global Affairs. He is an expert on Chinese politics, having authored numerous publications on the subject. Since 2006, he has also served as a senior fellow for China Studies on the American Foreign Policy Council. Welcome to both of you, and at this time, I'll turn over the floor to Dr. Desierto.
Thank you very much, Erica, and thank you to the Keough Center for Civil and Human Rights and to the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies for the opportunity to make today's lecture. I basically have three tasks for today and for the next 25 minutes. First is to discuss in a brief description what China's relationship is with the global human rights system. And second is to take a look at framing the old relativist position of China vis-a-vis its new relativist position as authored by the Chinese government. And finally, I will discuss briefly what some of the responses could be to the old and new relativisms in China's relationship with human rights. So if I may just share my screen. China is an active author in the global human rights system and has been so from the very beginning. It is, however, selectively not participant when it comes to international accountability mechanisms within the global human rights system. And there are unique paradoxes in that relationship. In particular, when one looks at the redefinition that's been initiated by China, whether it's been recasting capitalism with Chinese characteristics or socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era as part of Xi Jinping thought in 2017. China has also been steadily at work recasting human rights to suit its own mold with respect to its own philosophical, ethical, and geopolitical considerations. If we take a look at the major human rights treaties, there are a few that China have indeed ratified, such as the Convention Against Torture, the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the optional protocols of that convention, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So there are ratifications. But when it comes to the individual complaints procedures or the enforcement mechanisms that are contained within these human rights treaties, China has not accepted any of these procedures within its commitments to these human rights treaties. And the reason is as basic as this: China insists that any adjudication or enforcement of human rights law must be done domestically and to the exclusion of the international community. One thing that's also quite interesting to note is that as of 2022, China is also a very dominant player in international courts, tribunals, and global decision-making bodies. It has been part of the UN Human Rights Council. It always has a seat at the International Court of Justice and the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. It is a Security Council member. It has a seat at the World Trade Organization appellate body. It currently holds it heads four major organizations in the United Nations, the Food and Agriculture Organization, International Civil Aviation, Telecommunications, and Industrial Development. Over the last 10 years, China has managed to capture many of the seats, if not the leadership seats, within the UN system. And this is why the Council of Foreign Relations pointed to the need to understand China's approach to global governance. And that sense of the Middle Kingdom, as China calls itself, which looks at China as the cultural, political, and economic center of the world. By adopting a Sino-centrist worldview, the outlook is towards reshaping rules, norms, and institutions based on Chinese perspectives and less on a global pluralist system, or even more so on a universal understanding of human rights. And yet, before I go there was a time when China, from the very beginning in the drafting of the Human Rights Declaration, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the vice chair of the drafting committee was Pen Chun-chang, who himself is a Chinese academic, philosopher, playwright, was born in Tianjin, China, and was very prominent in the drafting of this declaration that spearheaded and led to the formulation and elaboration of subsequent human rights treaties. So even at the outset, China has been present at the drafting of the very human rights norms that we understand today. The difference is that with a Middle Kingdom Sino-centrist worldview, the approach towards enforcing and towards ensuring accountability for human rights has become a political question rather than a human rights question. And thus, Human Rights Watch points out that even on the global human rights system, Beijing is thus no longer content to deny people accountability within China. It now also seeks to bolster other countries' abilities to do so in international bodies, to deliver some semblance of justice internationally when it is blocked domestically. So within academia and journalism, the Chinese Communist Party does not only seek to deny the ability to conduct research, human rights related research or reporting from inside China, it increasingly seeks to do so from universities and publications around the world, punishing those who study or write on human rights topics. This development is now a foreign policy tool deployed around the world. Interestingly, Human Rights Watch documented that in June 2020, China sought to reposition international human rights law as primarily a matter of state-to-state relations, not a question of individuals seeking redress against states or groups seeking redress against states for the wrongful use of state power. Because by framing it as state-to-state relations, this will ignore the responsibility of states to protect the rights of individuals and to treat fundamental human rights as subject instead to interstate negotiation and compromise, thus excluding meaningful roles for civil society. Their March 2018 resolution involved using the Council's advisory committee, which resulted in many respects to creating its own resolution heralding the construction of a new type of international relations. The submission also claimed that human rights are simply used to interfere in other countries' internal affairs and merely poisons the global atmosphere of human rights governance. And this is not coincidental, as also observed in the same report, because China has routinely opposed the universality of both human rights and the enforcement of human rights, especially when this issue comes up before the United Nations. The United Nations the Human Rights Council passed a resolution, China has a resolution that passed which basically seeks to de-emphasize and remove the particular emphasis on monitoring and enforcement on a part of the UN Human Rights Council, trying to shift instead to cooperation and interstate responses. So in a way, this was a sea change because what used to be routine disclosure, reporting, contestation, and dialogue that was present at the UN Human Rights Council was simply recast as counterproductive interference on the sovereignty of nations under China's resolution. And thus, it was not a surprise that in 2018, when China underwent its Universal Periodic Review, even if China committed to 284 binding legal commitments to respect various human rights obligations, they did not agree to a monitoring system. They There were reports from Human Rights Watch that China had pressured UN officials to remove a UN country team submission from that review, that they pressured various member states to speak positively about China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims, and warned other governments not to attend a panel event, that there was also blatantly false information provided at the review, among other incidents. And interestingly also, what they've done is also take a look at the structures of the Human Rights Council and try to limit discussions in the agenda, even on atrocities relating to China. So it opposed a briefing by then High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad, to the Security Council in regard to Syria. In February 2020, it blocked a resolution at the Security Council in regard to the protection of ethnic Rohingya in Myanmar. And with respect to the selection of UN human rights experts, China has often had a heavier hand and has often tried to schedule, has declined to schedule visits by numerous special rapporteurs, including those with mandates on civil and political rights. So the actions are efforts to both block the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights from having any presence in China or having any particular independent monitoring or investigation or fact-finding within China. Brookings also reports that this coincides with China's selective compliance with international law. And the record stands for itself. It is 2022 and China has continually refused to implement a binding international decision issued by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the arbitral award in the Philippines versus China, which included, among others, duties to do environmental remediation for the mass destruction of the marine environment as a result of land reclamation activities in the South China Sea, as well as to cease the harassment and violence that was being committed by China's maritime militia against various subsistence fishermen in the region. However, there is compliance in another area of law, and there's general compliance when China loses, even when China loses from the WTO's dispute settlement body. But this is largely attributable to the structure of the WTO dispute settlement system itself that provides for an economic disincentive against non-compliance. Other states can engage in market retaliation and impose tariffs as authorized by the WTO if decisions of the WTO are not complied with. The selective compliance is also evident in what we continually see in Hong Kong with respect to the national security laws imposition, the continuing violations of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is supposed to remain applicable in Hong Kong, but which is not enforced within Hong Kong under the national security law. Even if there is some domestic legislation to implement those few human rights treaties that I discussed earlier, they are not themselves directly enforceable within the courts of China and often end up becoming illusory in practice without there being counterpart institutional mechanisms, let alone budgets provided for by China to enforce that legislation, such as, for example, those pertaining to the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. We see the same attitude of non-transparency to the United Nations in regard to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region policies and abuses, where there have been allegations of population reduction measures imposed, such as forced sterilizations, forced abortions, forced birth control, forced labor. None of this could be in any way verified independently or monitored or counter-checked within the UN system because China has not permitted a UN presence in the region. Even in climate change, where China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, at least in the past 10 years, more than any other country in the world. And as of 2005, China became the top greenhouse gas emitter. Its climate targets have not been ambitious enough. Even by aiming for carbon neutrality by 2060, it does not, at least according to the assessment of climate scientists, will not be enough because China remains the world's largest coal producer and accounts for about half of the world's coal consumed globally. Notwithstanding the commitment to carbon neutrality, China also repeatedly challenges the methods established under the Paris Agreement for how to estimate emissions and how to enforce emission standards. And they're not alone in that sense, but that does point to some of the selectivity that China has engaged in regard to the implementation of international law. So if we take a look at those attitudes, considering China had such a strong hand in the drafting of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one wonders why the relativisms emerged. In 1993, during the World Conference on Human Rights that was organized by the United Nations, which resulted in the Vienna Declaration of Human Rights, China led many countries, a few countries actually, in arguing that there should not be universal human rights, but rather one should consider Asian values as the basis for the interpretation of human rights. This was squarely rejected by the majority of delegates, the overwhelming majority of delegates, during the debates in that World Conference at the United Nations. In the end, the declaration that was issued by the United Nations affirmed the obligation to promote universal respect for, observance, and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, and further emphasized that the universal nature of these rights and freedoms is beyond question. One would have thought that the Asian values debate died by then. China's official response was that there's only harm that could be caused by the adoption of such a, in their view, a presumptuous, arrogant, and biased human rights approach, with the object of teaching others a lesson. And they would go on to say that this approach politicizes human rights and does not promote or protect them. In February 2021, interestingly, so moving from 1993 to the 2020s, for the first time, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the first time that there is a minister at that level who addressed the UN Human Rights Council, gave a specific speech which now changed strategies. So instead of asking for Asian values to be referred to or as the primary reference to interpret human rights, Foreign Minister Wang Yi argued that we should change human rights into people-centered rights, arguing that it should be the entire people's sense of gains, happiness, and security as the fundamental pursuit of human rights. And that in this sense, concepts such as peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, and freedom are paramount. And he held up China's claim of having eradicated extreme poverty as the prominent milestone in human rights achievement. Subsequently, the Foreign Ministry's spokesperson further elaborated this shift to a people-centered rights vision, referring more to subsistence and development and primary basic human rights, and a coordinated development of economic, social, cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. They did not say or nor explain where the coordination of development of civil and political rights would take place. So where are the old and new relativisms in this instance? It's quite interesting. There's about 3 of them. In the 1990s, the initial push was to reinterpret civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights by rejecting the universality of these rights and favoring cultural supremacy, some so-called Asian values, as the basis for understanding and implementing human rights. This was rejected, and also in a famous lecture by Amartya Sen somewhere in 1998, when he rejected the notion of there being a monolithic sense of Asian values, because Asia itself is inherently diverse, but also by his own rejection of the view that a push towards a more authoritarian understanding of human rights was not in itself productive to the actual promotion, realization, and implementation of human rights, or the achievement of human rights outcomes. And he called at that point for abandoning this notion of Asian values as the parameter by which human rights was to be evaluated and implemented and mediated. since the 1990s, that position has largely been accepted, which is why there has been a proliferation of the major human rights treaties that followed after the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But the interesting thing is that in the 2020s, we now see a de-emphasizing of the universality, the indivisibility, the inalienability, and the interdependence of all human rights, by instead focusing very narrowly on on an understanding of people-centered rights without clarifying the definition of a people, especially in the case of the right to self-determination and international human rights law. There's no settled definition of who that people is, and that could be particularly dangerous for minorities that suffer under the consequences of decision-making by majorities that tend to exclude. And instead, in the 2020s, there is also primarily an emphasis on rights that focus on generating economic growth from a very utilitarian standpoint of human rights that was not consistent with the understanding of human dignity as advanced originally in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was rather more materialist and more consequential and focused more on raw economic growth and not necessarily on the distribution of the gains from economic growth. There was less of a question of dealing with inequalities in various senses. So apart from that, what have we seen as well? Apart from the old and the new relativisms, what has been consistent for China's position from the 1990s to the present? It has always rejected international accountability institutions, and yet ironically, they sit in many of them. They have representatives in many of them. They capture leadership positions within the global system, and thus are very active in the normative authorship and elaboration of human rights law and treaty making, but opt out of any enforcement mechanism that in any way engages in the cooperation that China speaks about. But then again, this goes back to what I said earlier was discussed in the Council of Foreign Relations report, which is the notion of the Middle Kingdom in a Sinocentric worldview. So to the extent that China adopts its old and new relativisms, but continues its rejection of international accountability, this is not, at least in that worldview, a paradox, because to the extent that China has continually depicted international accountability institutions as Western imperialism, this pits two binaries of international accountability as somehow a challenge to exclusive state sovereignty and non-interference, instead of the actual cooperation and participation in the global human rights system that was originally designed dating back to the 1948 Declaration on Human Rights. And this is particularly problematic, perhaps more so in the 2020s than say in 1948, because now China's human rights footprint has a genuine global scope. We know of the reports and the various reports involving Xinjiang, the suppression of religious freedom, the allegations of genocide being committed against Uyghur Muslim communities, the many oppressions involving Uyghur women, involving decisions being made by the state over controlling their ability to have children, enforced birth control and forced sterilization allegations, as well as forced abortion allegations. We know of Tibet and the longstanding peaceful clamor for religious freedom and cultural rights and participation by Tibetans. We've seen and witnessed Hong Kong and the deterioration of civil and political rights, which used to be robustly respected in the region, ranking as high in the rule of law index, much higher in several metrics than the United States at some point, and yet now deteriorating so much given a national security law that is given both territorial and extraterritorial effects. We also see zero COVID policies within China, which have only served to deepen the derogations and limitations on economic, social, cultural rights and civil and political rights due to the heightened social controls. And now even the Belt and Road Initiative projects have been a testament as well. Reports are coming out with respect to labor violations, environmental violations, child rights violations, and women's rights violations coming out of BRI projects in Asia, as well as in Africa, Latin America, and Oceania. And there's the South China Sea activities, as I discussed earlier. There have also been discussions regarding China-based cyber attacks, which were not limited to government agencies, but also included the private sector. It also involved the information of individuals, of individual consumers, among others, and still ongoing repression against both foreign and local human rights defenders, lawyers, and journalists within China. So given those old and new relativisms and the particularly complex relationship of China with the global human rights system, that it is also steadily capturing from an institutional standpoint and seeking to rewrite from its own normative standpoint and its own philosophical standpoint of adopting a Sinocentric worldview as part of the Middle Kingdom. What are some of the responses to old and new relativisms? And we've seen this play out a little bit with respect to the diplomatic boycott in the Olympics. International law contains various tools to induce compliance, but they also have to be applied with considerable judicious discretion and with an eye for the impact and outcomes of these particular tools. They're not tools to be used lightly. There are Security Council authorized measures that could be used, but because China is a permanent member of the Security Council, it is highly unlikely that this will be feasible, since this will call for a Security Council resolution. Indeed, there's been no such Security Council resolution that has ever sought in any way to enforce human rights in any way within China or in relation to the activities of the government of China. There could be retortions, such as what the United States has done with respect to suspending foreign aid, which is an unfriendly but still a very lawful act in seeking to retaliate against the injurious legal activities of another state. What is predominantly used now, and which has apparently had more consequences, more significant consequences for human rights compliance, are economic sanctions. But this is a situation where you also have to tread very lightly, because the legality of economic sanctions also depends on ensuring that you do not violate human rights law or international criminal law, such as causing a forced starvation on a population. The primary means would be countermeasures under the International Law Commission's draft articles on the responsibility of states. Now, the measure in itself must be proportional. It must be temporary. It must seek to induce compliance on the part of the violating state, the injuring state. It must also not violate human rights law, humanitarian law, the prohibition on the use of force, among others, or particular norms from which you cannot derogate, otherwise known as jus cogens norms. And in many respects, the United States and many other countries have sought to impose their measures or characterize their boycotts under the aegis of countermeasures. But there's also a much neglected tool that has not been widely used in the international system. And this is our Article 41 duties of states: not to recognize, not to give aid, and not to assist in the ongoing commission of serious breaches of jus cogens, or the peremptory norms of international law, such as those that involve the prohibition against genocide, against slavery, against aggression, against principles and rules concerning the basic rights of the human person, slavery, and racial discrimination. This gives a role to all states in the world not to extend recognition to any of these violations that are occurring within the global footprint of China's human rights impacts in many of the situations I've discussed earlier. And that has not been widely used in many respects because, for a variety of reasons, China has also deployed both hard and soft power to avoid that situation coming to the forefront. And finally, something that has not yet been explored but is presently being proposed is to go back to a public review at the United Nations Human Rights Council. This year, at least, China is already in the mid-term of its Universal Periodic Review, and thus it is perfectly legitimate to ask the Council to examine the state of China's compliance with the 284 binding legal commitments that they took on to observe and protect and respect human rights in those legal commitments. In that respect, permits, even if China frames human rights as an interstate relationship, the UN Human Rights Council is the prime, would under that vision would be the prime venue for examining that particular relationship and using that interstate relationship to undertake public review at the UN Human Rights Council, admitting civil society, admitting submissions from all corners and all comers with respect to the actual state of China's compliance or non-compliance with its binding legal commitments to observe, protect, and respect human rights. And finally, one of the things that that I would love to discuss as well is that we should also calibrate our responses. As I said, it's not as if this is not something that has not been going on for a really long time. It's been going on for a very long time. The exceptionalist behavior, the relativist approaches have been there. So there has to be a calibration of how to respond. There might be circumstances where providing a face-saving political alternative or strategy to engagement would, say, possibly encourage more reporting and transparency. It took 2 years, for example, before the World Health Organization was permitted inside China to even undertake basic verification of an investigation in regard to the origins of COVID. And even then, their particular investigation was very much limited and constrained under the surveillance and oversight strategies that were deployed by the Chinese government. But in that sense, in this particular give and take, if we see here that China is not only trying to reshape human rights law by reinterpreting it, by expanding it, by recasting it into people-centered rights under a xenocentric worldview, and eliminating accountability, then the responses must also be calibrated to the various circumstances in which this applies throughout the world. Let me stop here and turn over to Dr. Eisenman. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that excellent examination. You've covered so much, Professor Desierto. First, let me, of course, begin by thanking Keough Center and the Lu Institute for hosting this very timely discussion. As I'm listening to your comments, which are, I think, quite concerning for a variety of reasons. And I'll come clean. I'm a liberal professor. I believe in universal rights. Guilty as charged on that one. So it's quite concerning to me. So I wanted to start off with a question I think kind of begs to be asked here. Given China's phenomenal success, I would say, in manipulating the UN system, as you've described here, which, by the way, is contrasted with its lack of success on the UNCLOS decision you mentioned with regard to the Philippines and the South China Sea. So with regard to the UN system, it's got a mixed record, but on human rights, as you've laid out, it's actually been quite successful in recreating the UN Human Rights Council and other things, and log rolling in order to support and creating, as you explain, a kind of a toothless enforcement mechanism that kind of cannot penetrate within China's boundaries. Now looking at this success then, and then if we look at the kind of views of China around the world, that Keough has done a variety of survey research on this, we see in about 2018, we see those numbers collapse, right, pre-COVID. And that dovetails pretty closely with the heavy human rights crackdowns going on in Xinjiang that you mentioned, at Hong Kong that you mentioned, the kind of tough policies towards Taiwan, a variety of different efforts. So I wanted to juxtapose these things for you and ask you about this, right? And on one hand, we have China being very successful on the institutional level in getting its ideas pushed forward. But on the other hand, it seems on the normative level, a lot of countries don't seem to be very happy with this and seem to be China's status in their eyes seems to be falling due to the human rights concerns. And so I guess my question, first question kind of off of this is, do you agree with this? And if you do, can the center hold, or will this permanently undo and undermine our UN institutional frameworks if the norms so diverge from the institution's ability to enforce those norms that people begin to feel maybe disillusioned with the institutions? And perhaps that's even China's goal, right? To not change the institution as much as render it irrelevant. Anyway, I've laid out a bunch here, but these are the tensions I see and in your amazing talk, and I wanted to see if you could help elucidate them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eisenman. That is a lot to unpack right now, but let me start off first and foremost with thinking about how do you live with one of the biggest countries in the world, if not the large countries with a country with the biggest population in the world, that basically has an entire governmental apparatus that looks at human rights selectively, right? So one way would be to think, should we just automatically see this as a geopolitical contest between those who will use human rights and say, this is what is universal? Or do we see this more from the spectrum of actual human rights victims themselves? The concern here, at least from my end, I'm less concerned about which country rises or falls in the geopolitical consequence as I am for the universality of human rights and the understanding that if we don't have mechanisms for individuals to seek redress, there is no right. You can claim that you have a right, but if you can't go anywhere to try and enforce it against whoever is abusing that right, such as the situations that occurred during the Arab Spring, or even here in the circumstances I've laid out in my lecture, if there is no accountability, there is no right. And so the pushback has to happen. And in fact, it is happening at the UN system. Ironically, when the United States decided to withdraw from the Human Rights Council in a previous administration and decided to take a step back on human rights support and supporting the UN system, it was other more democratic countries that stepped to the forefront, not necessarily Europe, not necessarily Canada. It was countries such as India, countries that also have complex human rights situations of their own, but also saw that there was, to their minds, something that was troubling with a complete elimination of accountability, such as deleting or not opting into any of the treaty-based procedures, not allowing for any kind of cooperation and participation in the world. So there's a paradox of things taking place. Like there's going to be some co-optation or capture of international institutions. That's part of the realpolitik that occurs when countries such as the United States decide to withdraw. There will be a vacuum that will be filled by others. But there is a corresponding pushback by even smaller states, such as Jamaica, who are one of the foremost authors of the treaties, the human rights treaties, and themselves, from the standpoint of the Group of 77, the non-aligned movement, have been more able to align in favor of pushing back in ensuring that there are enforcement mechanisms, or at least there are discussions at the Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council. It's not a perfect system, but at least insofar as this paradox that you very rightfully depict, I mean, there's been effectiveness, there appears to be effectiveness when it comes to controlling COVID, although that's basically drawn from the source. There's not been an independent investigation, right? So we don't know, but we know that the government reports that COVID has already been controlled or contained. And we know from the pace of the variants that, notwithstanding zero COVID, variants made it inside China as well. So, but because we don't have that openness with respect to the international institutions, the very same international institutions that China seeks to lead will always have this tension of how can you try and capture international institutions when you don't want to fully cooperate in the very same institutions that are designed for global human rights protection. But it's not a sufficient answer, but it's the best I can do at this rate.
No, it was great, and I understand it was a hard ball. Another one for you then. So you've given a great discussion about how China itself, as the Middle Kingdom, kind of puts itself in a different position in terms of the enforcement within China's borders, and how a variety of different groups within China's borders. I would add to that, by the way, a feminist, LGBTQ, and the so-called anti-sissy movement that's underway. It's very concerning for a variety of reasons, but all of these internal groups. But you mentioned, but didn't spend as much time. So I want to tease you out on it. How China, in altering these norms, also seeks to protect other regimes. For example, I think you mentioned Myanmar, and I know in the past they protected Robert Mugabe as well. So what do you think is the kind of long-term implication of taking this effort to protect sovereignty above individual human rights, not just within China, but on the road, right? Taking it to other countries and protecting other regimes. How concerned are you about this?
Very, because in particular, this is not the situation in the 1990s when there was an overwhelming rejection of the approach to try and dumb down or diminish universality. This time around, when democratic backsliding has led to about 60% of the world that is either now autocratic or semi-autocratic, China has more allies in seeking this reinterpretation and rewriting of human rights. And from the standpoint of a human rights victim, who frankly, all of this is above anybody's head, in the reality of whether or not you can enforce your right to speak, your right to express oneself, your right to your education, the right to make health decisions for oneself, your right to access to a court, if any particular government official or private party seeks to violate your rights, that's concerning. Because now reframing human rights as a matter of interstate relations rather than what it was originally supposed to be, about the human and not about the interstate relationship, basically guts the very understanding and the foundation of human rights altogether. And if this is all based on the political compromises that could be made by states, we're going to see more than democratic backsliding. We're going to see human rights eradication over a long period of time. And that can occur because it becomes obsolescent, or people, especially during COVID, we get normalized with the understanding that, yes, it's okay for us to be subject to all of these restrictions. But if you're under a period of emergency for a protracted amount of time, that becomes the normal. And so our own expectations as individuals of what we can do and how we can mobilize, how we can connect to others who feel and experience the same grievances, the same affronts to our human dignity, to our human rights, will tend to be muted and sublimated in the face of there's nothing we can do because the state apparatus is vast. And that is the worst possible predicament for human rights defenders. I'll take the opportunity now to talk very briefly about the fact that more than any other time, as of 2022, the United Nations has reported that this is the time that's the most dangerous for human rights defenders. We have lost in just the last 2 years of this pandemic. There's been an estimate of about 3,000 to 6,000 human rights defenders that have already been disappeared, killed, threatened, or arbitrarily detained, or whose whereabouts are not heard at this point in time. That raises the danger levels precisely because when it's interstate relations, there are no guarantees insofar as the defense of human rights is concerned.
Wow, tough state of play. I wanted to try to, if we could, fashion our faces or put ourselves in the shoes of Chinese leaders to the best we can, understanding that's an imperfect, but doing our best. And if we look from the perspective of Chinese leaders, perhaps they might say, well, if we grant, human or universal rights, then it may result in our country being torn asunder. And we would prefer to keep our country together and not torn apart. And we believe that the history is clear, that the West uses these things as a cudgel against us, that they're happy to engage in their own, anti-democratic behavior at home, but then they'll criticize us for it. And many people point to this diplomatic boycott of the Olympics as just yet another example of a time of Western hypocrisy. So I wanted to just ask you to address this point, right? Because we hear it quite often. We're hearing it right now that this is actually it's anti-Asian bias, right? It's anti-Chinese bias. It shouldn't be tolerated, right? So is this what do you make of this argument that has become quite prevalent in our discourse?
So if you recall what I said in terms of the responses that states can make to call for compliance, I mentioned the Article 41 response, not to recognize human rights violations, not to aid or otherwise assist in human rights violations. So from the standpoint of those third states who have engaged in a diplomatic boycott, they have a legal justification for doing so. They're authorized to do so because there's been long-standing non-compliance. Because the alternative is, what can you do when the state itself deliberately refuses to participate in the global human rights system, but wants to also rewrite the global human rights system? So which hypocrisy is greater under those circumstances? Certainly, I'm not partial to any specific country. So far as I'm concerned, everybody has a human rights record that they have to deal with. But the difference remains that even if, for example, even if a lot of people could, rightly take the United States to task over its many failures on racial justice, it still provides for a redress mechanism, for the ability to go to courts, for the ability to demand information, to ability to be accountable. That's a totally radically different situation when there is neither internal accountability except within the party, and there's also no external accountability. So I would actually think the diplomatic boycott is the lesser evil. And I wouldn't even call it an evil because it's an unfriendly act. It's perfectly lawful and legitimate to do so, but it sends the message. And the fact is the message has to be sent precisely because the ongoing normalization of human rights violations are proceeding in a rapid pace. As between being called hypocritical, I mean, at some point, everybody's a hypocrite. At some point, when everybody doesn't have a perfect human rights record. Everybody deals with their human rights records on a day-to-day basis. But it's a question of who wants to be accountable for them. And China has not given this response, not so far. And so looking at it from gradations of escalation, I actually think the diplomatic boycott is the least escalation, lowest level of escalation that's possible, that sends the message that this will not be recognized, it will not be tolerated in the international system.
Well, that's fantastic. I actually have a couple of questions here in the chat that I'm going to give you that are related directly to this. But I might just add that in dealing with this particular question myself, the question of Western hypocrisy, my approach has been to say that it's wrong to make the same mistakes the United States has made. That we are suffering greatly for our mistreatment of our minorities, and following us down that road would not be, a justification. In fact, it's a cautionary tale, if anything, about and rather than a reason to justify. So, but this is something we hear a lot, and I really appreciate you mentioning it. Now, in terms of these questions here, one is a reference again to the diplomatic boycott, and the questioner asks, the Olympics are currently going on in Beijing, and the U.S. declared the boycott of the games over concern about China's human rights record, especially concerns of the treatment or genocide of the Uyghur population. For those who are still learning about China, can you please tell us what are the concerns regarding China's treatment of Uyghurs, and whether you believe the boycott will actually be effective? And if not, what else can the international community do? And I think you are referencing this being the kind of first step. So maybe what other steps do you see as possible steps that could be taken?
So reports have been issued in regard to the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang that date back several decades. And those reports have been with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Very recently, there have been other reports that have emerged as well from Uyghur Americans who have many families still in Xinjiang, who report based on witness accounts and testimonies of the mistreatment and the forced labor, forced abortions, forced sterilizations that are taking place to control the population in Xinjiang. Those are allegations, and they have also been reinforced with a People's Tribunal decision that collected so many of these narratives in London and recorded them. And so to the extent that among international lawyers, there is a lot of discussion as to whether or not what's occurring is a genocide. And we can argue about the differences about what makes it a genocide or not a genocide, at least insofar as the allegations and the testimonies are concerned. It does appear to be a plausible situation that genocide, or the attempt to eliminate or otherwise control a population by virtue of their race, their religion, is taking place, or at least there are plausible reports that this is taking place. If that is the case, states who are parties to the Genocide Convention, that's almost all states in the world, are obligated, all of them have obligations to prevent and to punish the commission of genocide. So for countries that are seeking a diplomatic boycott, they also will frame this as, this is part of our duties as third states to help prevent in the ongoing commission of genocide. Now, the appropriate response might be for China to say, let's submit this for, if this were any other country, they'd open their borders and say, let's do the fact finding right now. But they have rejected any involvement with the International Criminal Courts, the Office of the Prosecutor. They've rejected any independent fact finding by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They have not allowed the special rapporteurs in for purposes of doing their independent fact finding within their mandates. So there's virtually no other way in which China could engage in this discussion other than to issue the political statements that this is not taking place. So as a result, the diplomatic boycott is being used as I said earlier, a countermeasure, an instrument of non-recognition of ongoing human rights violations, and possibly a mechanism by which to implement these states' understandings of their duty to prevent genocide, as the reports have come out.
Excellent, excellent. So I've got one more question here in the text here. I'll give to you, and then maybe tack on one of my own, and maybe we could wrap up after that.
Sure.
And this one's particularly good because I think it gets to a point that's it's usually hard, even for experts to parse through. And that goes to the point you were making about Asian values. And so the questioner asks, what would be an example of Asian values in human rights that would conflict with universal standards of human rights? And if I might add my own kind of editorial here quickly on the end of this question. I've heard Chinese friends talk to me about how they themselves feel the concept of Asian rights is pejorative, that it suggests that somehow Asian people don't have the same rights as others, that what is universal for, say, somebody in Latin America or Africa is not for them. And so they find it actually, the whole concept of it somewhat insulting, even though they themselves are Chinese, sometimes pretty nationalistic Chinese actually, will feel that they don't like that the use of this term. So I think this is an excellent question. And the question that I had, which was separate from this that I'll tag along here, is that we've seen that China within the UN framework has put together dozens of nations in the global South to sign on that it's actually advancing human rights, right? It uses these joint statements very effectively, and it gets countries from all around the global South to sign on to them, and dozens of them, such that if countries in the West have a few dozen countries, China will have 3 or 4 dozen countries signing on over, the majority of even sometimes UN member nations. And I wanted to ask you what you thought of that tactic, how effective it was, and whether or not you think it will continue, and what do you make of that tactic in general? So again, these two questions: the one on Asian values and how they conflict with human rights standards, and then the approach and strategy China uses.
Let me take the second question first and end on the Asian values question. Using the polling approach among states precisely is effective in making human rights a matter of interstate relations rather than claimable individual or group rights. And that's why it's so effective, because now it's become a question of how many countries side with X state, how many countries side with X state, when nobody's really asking actual human rights victims. No one's part of this process. And yet that's what the universality of human rights was supposed to protect. That this was not supposed to be a matter of interstate determination, but rather interstate accountability. There's no voice. And so when you reshape the debate to make us think about the geopolitical consequences, you're virtually forgetting about the actual human rights victims. So to the extent people talk about hypocrisies, for me, that's neither here nor there, because at the end of the day, how do we get to the desired human rights outcome? What do we do for those? We can feel outrage for Rohingya when they're treated that way by the Myanmar government. What do we do or we can feel outrage when the Taliban act towards the Afghanistan? But what do we do in the face of people from Hong Kong, or people in Tibet, or people who have been affected by the national security laws? These are individuals, but escalating this into an interstate discourse is what helps everybody forget that we're dealing with individuals. It makes it so much easy to other. And that's the biggest danger, because the day that we look at human rights as it happens over there, and it involves those states, then it makes it so much easy to, give force to what Martin Luther King used to say, right? I mean, to the extent that a violation that happens here happens everywhere. Because in the end, it is about the kind of conduct that we normalize and authorize or tolerate on the part of states. Going to the question of Asian values, I mean, that's a very legitimate question. In 1993, around the 1990s, when this debate came out about what is an Asian value, in the first place, Asia is extremely homogeneous, from east to South Asia to Central Asia, deeply homogeneous region. So that was one of the first critiques that Amartya Sen brought out in the notion of what is an Asian value. But the way that it was politically legitimized or politically deployed in the debates on the World Declaration was to call for, say, the reinterpretation of how we understand our basic understanding of the right to life, or the right to speech, or the right to religion, and the right to practice one's religion. What the Asian value version of it was supposed to be was you could only practice religion if it coincided with the culture that put forward certain values. But even countries such as Malaysia, when Mahathir Mohamad joined China in this kind of articulation of Asian values, other ASEAN countries pushed back because they said, this doesn't exist. Even within our region, this doesn't exist, which is why you found subsequent regions of the world come out with their own human rights declarations, elaborating their own understandings of human rights, but none of them have ever detracted from the idea of universality, whether it's the Arab Charter, the ASEAN Charter, the Inter-American Court, or the American Convention, the European Convention, or the African Charter on Human Rights. None of these ever rejected the notion of universality. Now, it's not even necessary to reject that universality, but simply recast it. There's no universality that's being questioned. We're just putting this as an interstate people-centered approach rather than a human rights approach. And that's dangerous, especially for minorities who have historically been marginalized by virtue of race, by virtue of belief, by virtue of gender or sexual orientation, among others. And that should be of concern to everybody in the world. I guess I'll wrap up here.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a real treat. And I think you all who've joined have really, realized why Professor Diane Desierto is a rock star here at the Keough School and at Notre Dame. And so we're really, I'm excited to be a part of this discussion. I look forward to the next installment. And so I see we're a couple minutes over. So why don't I go ahead and pass it back to Erica here. And thank all of our participants for joining us. And of course, thank Professor Diane Desierto for enlightening us here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eisenman.
Yes, thank you both. This concludes today's event. We were so happy that all of you could attend.